Please note, this podcast series features graphic descriptions of forensic pathology techniques, violent crimes, accidents, and traumatic incidents that some listeners may find distressing or upsetting. Wherever tragedy strikes, forensic pathologists follow, tasked with the important work of disaster victim identification, often in the most trying and confronting circumstances. Professor Prof Byard was on the ground in the wake of the 2002 Bali Bombings and the 2004 Boxing Day Tsunami in Thailand, and reveals how, even in the midst of so much death, he witnessed one of the most beautiful things he'd ever seen in his life. From The Advertiser, True Crime Australia and the University of Adelaide, this is Guardians of the Dead, a podcast exploring the ground where death and science meet. I'm Greg Barilla.
Today we're here to talk about disaster victim identification with Roger. Roger, tell us a bit about what it's like to do DVI.
Well, people talk about DVI as if it's one thing, and of course everyone is different. When it originally started, people were saying, well, it's part of a process where you have a disaster, so you've got a major disruption of a community, it's financially stretched, they can't cope with what's going on, and casualties have to be identified. But then, as it was sort of established, it really became the process of just identifying multiple victims in an incident. So it could be a car accident with, say, 4 people in it, or it could be something like the tsunami with thousands.
What was the first case like this that you had to work on?
I just thinking it was probably Snowtown, actually, but we didn't treat it as a disaster victim identification then, because it's really just evolved, I think, since Bali and Thailand, and then other episodes around the world. So it's only in the last probably 10 or 20 years where people have really started to work out how this process should work. And there are very sort of strict protocols. Interpol has said this is the way you should do it. It's run by the police commander. There's a DVI team. So each one has a similar sort of framework, but each one, of course, is entirely different, because if it's a suicide bombing, that's a lot different to a light aircraft going down in the Gulf. So
the Bali bombings then would have been the first big sort of identification incident that you had to attend?
Yep.
And how did that come about? How were you involved in that?
Well, basically, the Australian Federal Police were asked to assist because there were, out of the 202 dead, I think there were 88 Australians.
There was no warning, just a massive explosion.
This is horrendous. I've never seen anything like it.
Those inside the Sari nightclub stood little chance.
There was another explosion, and that's when buildings start to collapse.
And then just shattering glass everywhere.
The bomb left a massive crater in the street.
Inhuman act of terrorism.
Australia has offered expert help.
As you know, Bali Kuta's just a place where people go to have a good time, and then having this just happen was horrific. So the Australian Federal Police then set up command posts, and then they got various experts in, so they'd have teams coming in on a rotation basis. You'd have a pathologist, somebody to look at the DNA, dentists, fingerprint experts, and so essentially the aim is initially to secure the scene, to work out what's happened. And of course the first thing is to get the injured out. It's all very well to worry about the dead, as we must, but the injured have priority. So they're moved out. And then you must treat it like a crime scene, so don't interfere with it. And one of the things I noticed when I was watching television with the Bali bombings, that there were police there at the Sari Club, or what was left of the Sari Club, and there were people sweeping up, trying to help.
So we're just grabbing bed linen and water and sort of help them out a bit, I suppose. But then they went off to the hospital.
Now what you're doing is you're destroying the evidence, because what you want to know is where the epicenter of the blast was, where the fragments are, who was closest, do the injuries fit what's happened? Because what's the best way to hide a murder in the middle of a pile of bodies? So you need it all mapped out very carefully, and then the bodies have to be photographed where they are, and all body parts as there were, and then they have to be taken to a secure place. And the problem is, in third world countries, they often don't have the facilities.
So how long after the bombings did you arrive in Bali?
With Bali, I came in at a later stage. So you have basically the first responders who are there to do the identifications, and then as it progresses, the people who come in later are doing more sort of auditing and re-examining remains. And I actually worked out an index to see how successful a DVI is by the number of times you have to re-examine bodies. If you're not re-examining any because you've done it right the first time, then that's great. If you re-examine 100%, then you've obviously not done it correctly. I was there a month or two after it had happened, and of course the facilities were not good, and the preservation of the bodies was not good. The bodies had been fragmented and burnt. What happened at the Sari Club when they set the first bomb off was that the bomb was in a vehicle in the street, and it blew through the wrought iron and glass at the front of the club. So what you get is you get secondary projectiles. So it's not only the explosion and the material out of the bomb, it's this glass and metal that's going in as well.
Australian names added by the minute.
It was just a procession of people covered in blood, covered in glass, glass shards embedded into people. People's backs had obviously been on fire.
Then you get people panicking and trying to escape.
They're all going to die, they're all going to die. And we're just like, oh, what's going on?
They're piling up, and you get crush asphyxias. The fire was there, so there's burns and carbon monoxide toxicity.
People are burnt everywhere.
Just flames just skyrocketing up into the sky.
Local hospitals overwhelmed.
Many only just made it out before the club collapsed.
It was one blast.
So it's a really quite complicated scenario. And essentially you're also looking for bits of the bomb. And this is one of the problems in terrorist actions is, has all the explosive material been detonated, or is there stuff hidden in bodies? That can be quite dangerous, obviously.
So when you get there, is the facilities similar to what you would find here, or do you have to improvise once you get there and hit the ground and have to find different ways of doing things that you might do here?
Yeah, no, it's very different. I mean, we had, I think, facilities for storing 8 bodies in the mortuary in Denpasar. And initially they were just putting ice on top of the bodies. And then the bodies were being stored in containers. But you had a number of teams working on the bodies. And so there were a number of different numbering systems. So it was all pretty confusing. And one of the problems with DVIs is that everybody wants to help. And so you get teams coming from all over the world, and they have to be housed, they have to be fed. The international language for DVI is English. They might not speak English. So although they want to contribute, they're actually draining resources. So that adds to the chaos as well. And I think chaos is one of the things that is a theme that runs through DVIs. When I was on the DVI committee here, my first requirement was we get signs around the state saying, keep out. And we sort of pause for 48 hours, work out what we're going to do. We're going to hasten slowly. The last thing you want to do is come in and speed the process. Some of the local bodies in Indonesia were released on visual identification, and we know that that's not good. Some of the bodies, I believe, were released in the early days based on jewellery. And, the jewellery you get in Kuta is available to everybody. So it can be heartbreaking because you may have identified a body, but you have to follow the process, even though you know the family want that person back. But you've just got to follow the rules. So it's complicated. I mean, I think the most confronting DVI was Thailand. That was the tsunami in December 2004. Confronting because there were just so many dead people.
A wall of water smashes into Thailand's Patong beach. As it hit the beach, it just exploded.
It sounded like as if bombs were going off, so we just ran.
The swell of water bulldozed its way through the town.
No one knew what to do.
Water streaming through the streets.
More than 300 people have been killed and holiday resorts left in ruins.
I had both of them in my hands and one on each arm, and then we started going under.
A 6-month-old baby, which was swept from its father's arms, has been confirmed as dead.
But there are further grim predictions for the number of dead.
After the waters died down, bodies are reportedly being found in the tops of trees.
The first day I arrived, you could smell where we were going, about 3 or 4 kilometres down the road. And I'm wandering around with my assistant, and we're just looking at these bodies. And then a truck pulled up and just dumped, I don't know, 50 to 100 bodies in a pile to be processed.
Another load of body bags is ferried through the tourist streets of Patong.
And of course it's in the tropics, so it's hot. It was a tsunami, so basically, it washed everything into pools.
Oh my God, look, it's just coming in now, right over the swimming pool.
The deluge carrying such force,
tossing cars about like corks.
And the sewers were open.
The sewage water was around your ankles and it was just terrible, so.
There are dead bodies, there's metal, tin, cars. It's really quite a dangerous environment.
We were running through broken glass and mud and blood and bits of cars. It was just frightening.
And very stressful and hard work, really.
So how do you know what to do when you first get there? If we go back to Bali for a second and you land and this is your first big disaster, how do you know what to do? What's the most pressing thing if you're faced with that kind of chaos?
Usually in the tropics, the most pressing thing is to find the closest toilet. And I don't say that lightly. You really need to have, proper facilities, and often you're lacking that. But essentially, the AFP commander is organising stuff. You have a meeting when you first arrive, and it's explained to you what's gone on, where they're at, what they expect you to do, who you're going to be working with, where you're going to go. And then in Bali, we were going to the mortuary. It was interesting because it was a terrorist action. We were getting into minibuses and going a different way every time. It was quite different to Thailand, which was, I'd say, more relaxed. I mean, we didn't have the security issues.
So do you mean there was always still a threat of more attacks, so that's why you had to have these evasive actions in place, I guess, to avoid the potential of that?
Well, what better way to get your point across than to take out the rescue teams? And I'm always amazed that this doesn't happen. I know terrorists understand this, so I'm not letting out any dirty secrets. But I talked to my colleagues in London after the London bombings. I said, what would have happened if they'd set a dirty bomb off 4 hours later? They said, we would have been overwhelmed. You set off a bomb with some anthrax in it, and you can cause tremendous disruption, and the system just won't work. So there's always that concern when you've had inflicted injuries like that.
So are you afraid?
No, I think, when you're naive, you don't get afraid. But I was also there sometime later. But I remember a colleague saying he was there in the first 2 weeks and a motorbike backfired outside the mortuary, and everybody went under tables and they locked down the place because you just don't know. And the thing with Bali, okay, you've had this incredible explosion. What's happened? Is it an underground gas leak? If it is a terrorist attack, are they going to come up over the hill with machine guns?
We'll be right back.
So when you were working there, what kind of hours were you pulling, and what was the actual work that you were doing?
It was different in Bali compared to Thailand. In Bali, we'd go out reasonably early to the mortuary, and then it would be going to cases that hadn't been identified, or that there'd been more remains found that needed to be linked to this particular case, and just so going through the cases like that. So it was really quite orderly. Whereas Thailand, essentially, I was there the second week, and as I said, there were just bodies coming in, And it was a 2.5-hour trip by bus to the site and 2.5 hours back. So, we had that on top of the day. And then you'd spend the day just, body would come in.
So you're doing it outside? Is that where the work is happening?
No, actually, it varied. The Thais, very generously, they worked outside so that the Europeans could work inside. But inside came with its problems. I mean, we were in a temple because they bring the bodies to the temples. It had no running water. It was really hot, and we couldn't clean the floors, so the floors were so slippery. So that was because it's the tropics, you're sweating, so hydration is really important. So you've got to think of your health as well.
And you mentioned like the heat is such a consideration because everything is speeding up in terms of, I guess, putrefaction and everything else. Do you still take the time to do an autopsy like you would here, or do you have to power through and just do the most pressing kind of procedures?
Well, the process of DVI, you start, as I said, with the scene, and then there's the ante-mortem phase, which is basically collecting material from a person's home or a person's family. So with a DVI, you've got to know who you're dealing with. And that was part of the problem with Thailand. There were a lot of Burmese workers who had no paperwork, and so those bodies remained unidentified. But with, say, Bali, we knew who was at the club, and so we knew who their families were. So you get that material so you can take hair for DNA or fingerprints or their dental records. And then we come to the actual examinations. And the way we tend to do it is we get the bodies, they're in storage, they're brought out, they get fingerprinted by the police, because fingerprints are a good way of identification. Then they come to the pathologist. The pathologist will examine the body. Is it an adult? Is it a child? Male? Female? We were doing just truncated internal examinations. We're just opening the abdomen. What we're looking for is any signs of surgery, and we're looking for uterus, something to show, that it was a female or whether it was a male, that sort of thing. Sometimes we would be looking for artificial hips, that sort of thing. Tattoos, important. Jewellery. Europeans often have their names on the inside of their wedding rings. And there are a lot of married couples in Thailand because it was a family event. One of the things that was unfortunate about Thailand, to start with, is that the pathologists weren't involved in discussing what to take for DNA. And I've forgotten what samples we were taking, but it was going to a Chinese lab that didn't specialise in human DNA, and they're only getting a 4% hit or something like that. Then we went back and we put it through a lab that was actually used to dealing with this. One of the things that developed in Thailand that was good, though, was family linkage. So rather than treating you, your husband, and the child as separate individuals, if you and your husband are identified, the children's DNA would be then compared to the people that we'd already got. So we didn't have to actually do that separately. So that was a good way of getting it to move faster. So once all the ante-mortem data's been collected, we've got DNA and fingerprints, and we have material from the examination of the bodies, we can then put the two together, the ante and the post-mortem, and usually there's a reconciliation panel. So it's a lot of the experts who are sitting down with the local authorities, and we say, yes, we've got fingerprints matching here, we've got this, does the pathology fit with this? Yes, it does. Are we all happy that there's this person? Yes. Are we prepared to sign off on it? Yes, we do. And then that person can be released. So it's a very rigid process. And then once the dust is settled, we have the debriefing, how well did we do? What do we do badly? What can we do better next time? There was a European group in Thailand who decided to dig foundations for their mortuary, and they uncovered the asbestos pile next to the temple. So, that's part of the debriefing process. That, in 30 years' time, half of us will get mesothelioma, I suppose.
So why were you called up? Was it your expertise in particular, or was it just that they needed people on the ground to be able to do all the work that needed to happen at that point?
No, it's expertise. I mean, they need dentists. They sometimes need anthropologists. Certainly in the World Trade Center they did. But they need forensic pathologists. They need people who know how to examine a dead body. They need to have people who've got experience in piecing things together, in looking at the cause and manner of death to make sure it actually fits properly, and who can actually do the work. some of the injuries were extraordinary. I had a colleague from New Zealand call me over and he said, "Look at this," and it was a body and the head. It looked like a shotgun blast. And I said to him, "Have you found any pellets?" He said, "No, I can't find a thing." And we worked it out because the speed that the water was carrying the bodies was so great that this person must have hit a cement stanchion or something like that to cause the injury. But you've got to make sure that it fits. So if there are injuries there, you want to make sure they're not stab wounds.
So how many bodies do you think you examined during the tsunami?
Oh, hundreds, actually. Not all with autopsies, but I went to a site where they'd exhumed a lot of bodies, and we were going through those quite rapidly. So there's a lot of cases.
Are there any in particular that stand out? Any that really remain with you?
Oh, the one that remains with me, I didn't ever see him, but when you arrive at the temple, which is where the Thais bring the bodies, and the temple environment's extraordinary. The monks were just amazing. They would wander around at night chanting, helping the spirits go to wherever they're going to go. Didn't matter whether you're a Catholic or a hedonist. They were going to help you do that, and I thought that was a wonderful way to look after the people. And I think it must have been a lot of comfort for the people at home to know that these people were actually there caring. But outside the compound, the Thais had all of these notice boards, and they had pictures of people, pictures of the bodies with teeth so that people could recognise it. They were giving out CDs so families could take the CDs home and see if there was anything they could recognise. But there were also notice boards with pictures of missing people. And there was a little boy, he was Scandinavian with these beautiful blue eyes. He must have been, 18 months or 2. And it was just an address from the family. And you knew that even if they did ever get him back, which is probably unlikely, he would not be their little boy. So that, he sticks with me.
How long were you there for?
Just 2 weeks. Yeah, we were just
you say just 2 weeks, but I bet it felt probably longer than 2 weeks.
I thought 2 weeks was a very short time before I did it. Yeah, I was asked to go back, but I refused. I couldn't do it.
What was it like? Do you think on that the flight over compared to the flight back? How was that?
I think when you're part of the team, it's fine. And I think this is what happens in the military. You know, you're part of an important process, and there's a lot of camaraderie and black humour. But when you're coming back, you've done a good job. It's when you get home, and you're sitting in your house on your own, and you're thinking, "What in the name of God have I just seen?" And that's why I didn't want to go back. I just found it was one of the most confronting periods, I think, in my career. And I didn't expect. I thought I'd seen everything.
Was that just because of the scale of it, or because of the kinds of injuries you were seeing, or like you mentioned that photo of that little boy and the tragedy after tragedy and families after families that were affected by or devastated by what had happened?
Yeah, it was the scale of it, but it was also things like seeing photographs of a wedding photograph of a young couple in the sand. Clearly one of them had it in their belongings and it had just been washed away, and you can see this young, they look Norwegian couple. Maybe they're on their honeymoon. And that sort of sticks with you. When you think of them having such a great time. There was the Thais were selling videos up at Khao Lak where we were based, and it was extraordinary. Up on the hill, a family had been having a lunch, and they were videoing it as the water went out. And all the tourists were down on the beach sort of looking stunned and walking out, and there was a fellow standing calling to his family to come to have a look, and the Thais who were filming could see the tsunami coming, and they were calling out to him, and then he just, this spray of water, and then he just disappeared. It was really quite it was like nothing I've seen before or since.
What's it like going in as an Australian to a different country and working respectfully in those places?
Well, that's one of the major issues, because the last thing we want is Australians to go in and behave like the big experts as if the locals know nothing. That sort of cultural arrogance is really, really offensive to everybody. There were instances with some of the teams, there were some Thai flags in one of the huts. They put their own national flag over the Thai flag. It's a deadly insult. And, it's not hard to work out. But there are little things like, touching kids on the head and, so we did talk about the local cultural requirements, but the locals looked after us really well. I actually put on weight because they had a little tent out the front, and all the locals would make food at home and bring it in for us. So my police friends were eating sort of soggy sandwiches from the hotel, and I was dining like a king with this.
Doesn't it smacks of that sort of white saviour mentality to come in and stick your flag over something and expect everybody to laud what you're doing rather than respecting this awful tragedy that's happening, and these, like you say, these Thai people still looking after you and caring for you and making sure that you're okay while dealing with what's been going on.
And, they were living with it. It was in their backyard. So, no, I've got a lot of respect for the way the Thais and the Thai people handled that process.
So do you process those two events differently, one being a natural disaster and obviously one being an act of human evil? Does that affect how you feel about these afterwards or even while you're there?
It's interesting, so it's an act of human evil. I was actually involved in evaluating one of the suicide bombers. And I just didn't have any feeling at all. I mean, I just felt sad about the whole process. But again, we're sort of buffered as pathologists because it's a process we're going through. We have a duty to the dead. Thailand was interesting in that I saw some of the worst scenes I've ever seen. I saw some of the most beautiful. I was talking about the monks. They had a ceremony to honour the dead, and they put up 2,000 rice paper lanterns that went up into the sky. That actually diverted planes around, and it was like the Milky Way was just overhead. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. You could sort of almost touch them. And then the next day we were back sort of getting truckloads of bodies. So, yeah, each one is different.
What always strikes me when we speak is that so many of us just live our lives going to the office or sort of dealing with those mundanities, I guess, which you become grateful for after a while because it protects you from some things. But you are so exposed to those extremes, and death. Has it, I think I've asked you this question before, but I'm still so curious if it's changed you as you've experienced more and more of this. Does it make you treasure each moment, or does it make you believe in chaos, or how does that proximity to the extreme change who you are?
Like every day when I wake up and I check Google to see if I'm dead, and I'm not, is a good day.
Perfect.
It's just live every day, because that's one thing I have learnt. When it comes, it's going to come, but just maximise what you've got.
Do you think that, to you, does that mean just being grateful for the moment, or does it mean doing exciting things every day? What does living in the moment mean for you?
I think it's just appreciating what we've got. I mean, if we look at the COVID pandemic, in South Australia, we're in a really good position. And, you can just sit on your step sometimes and just look at the clouds and think, yep, this is okay. It's a bad time, but, we'll get through it. Don't catastrophize over stuff that may never happen.
Guardians of the Dead is brought to you by The Advertiser, True Crime Australia and the University of Adelaide. The show is produced by myself, Greg Barilla. Elisa Black is your host. Mixing and sound design by Emily Dorr. Make sure you're following Guardians of the Dead on your favourite podcast app. And if you enjoyed it, be sure to leave us a review. In episode 3, Roger discusses the bizarre ways people have been killed by animals, from leeches, roosters and sheep, to fish, monkeys and even camels. I'm Greg Barilla. Thanks for listening.